And so not until we peeled into their mindset about helping them change their mindset to be the best way to help my customer is to make sure their whole problem gets solved, were we able to slowly unpeel and get to see that behavior change. And this was the two parts of our conversation. So unlocking mindset to achieve the strategy, because without that shift, that organization would never have achieved the strategy about productivity and achieve the business case of the program. So again, we're delighted that you're with us. Today is meant to be two-way street. So we got three amazing panelists that I'll introduce you to shortly. But please, if you can keep your cameras on, participate in the poll, stay with us in the conversation. It's going to be a quick one. We're going to be out of here in about 55 minutes from now, and I will definitely keep us on time. So really encouraging you to participate. Now, I'm wondering if you've ever been in a shopping mall and you're like, okay, this place is huge. Where am I? We have at Lighthouse what we call the leadership system. And I just want to show you where today's conversation fits in our leadership system. So it's got three parts: align, change, and empower. We know that those are three things required to get leadership moving within an enterprise. Today's conversation sits at the heart of change. In our methodology, as we work with organizations, this is our tool called Unlearn. You'll learn about it today. This is our repeatable tool, credible, reliable, repeatable method to help organizations and individuals unlock the mindset that matches their strategy so that they can achieve what it is that they're trying to achieve. So that's where it sits. I thought we might spend a minute, and then we're going to ask you a question, so get yourselves ready, just talking about what does it mean to unlock mindset? What does that actually mean? So ultimately, achieving strategy requires the adoption of new behaviors. It's the CEO, it's herself, it's her lead team, others in the organization, so new behaviors. And I think most of our organizations understand that somehow mindset plays a part in changing our behaviors, but so often it's left unattended. And we'll talk perhaps today about why that is. But to unlock mindset, I gave you the example in the field technicians. I'll give you one more example, and I'm sure we can get some more as we progress. But to unlock mindset in a professional services setting, there was a firm I was associated with that wanted their senior leaders to initiate more provocative and meaningful client conversations with senior clients. And this is a very common thing in professional services, have a more strategic conversation with more senior people, right? What we discovered is there was a real hesitation among some very senior partners to have that conversation. And why that was is when they were asked to go outside their narrow and deep field of expertise. Like, I'll never forget one guy. He was one of the world's authorities on cloud technology back when it was a new thing. When you asked him to go outside of cloud or outside of technology and talk about the broader business, he actually had some insecurity. And to unlock that mindset took a bit of doing. And he and his colleagues, eventually, once they were made aware of this limiting factor, they were all able to shift their mindset slowly and over time. So that's another example of, strategically, that firm needed its senior partners to be having senior client conversations to achieve the strategy. But let's hear from you. I just wanted to give you a couple examples. So let's hear from you. So we'll pop a poll up in just a minute. This will be in your interface in MS Teams. And the poll's got two questions, and here they are. Question one will be, how do you approach mindset change in your organization? You got four options. We omit this. A second thing that some organizations do, they use one-to-one coaching to help individuals take new perspectives. Third, some organizations count on their leaders or their supervisors to help people with this, or you might have a fourth. And the second thing we'll get you to weigh in on is how effective is the approach that your organization takes. So we'll just launch that poll now, and we'll see what you all are experiencing. So you should see a little multiple choice opportunity. And then if you click, you'll see a chance to enter in some text about how effective your approach is. So we'll give everyone a moment to respond to that. And our panelists can then be equipped with a better understanding of the group that we have online today. So I'm seeing these happen in real time. I'm suspecting you are too. We've got 18 responses. Just give ourselves another couple of minutes. Keep those coming in. All right, great. We've got 27 responses, so that's a very good sample. And just to test, Barry, you happen to be on my screen. Can you put your thumb up if you see the responses in real time? Like, is everybody looking at this at the same time? Thumb down. Okay. So I can see it. Let's share those responses out. Can you share those out for us, Jenna?
It doesn't give me an option. Everyone should be able to see it, maybe in the chat otherwise. But we had 18% say we don't, 21% say one-on-one coaching, and 61% say leader-led for question one.
Aha. Okay, a few of us, I see. So if you go in the chat, there's definitely something you can click. Excellent. So question one, 18% said we don't address mindset. Question two, or 24% said you use one-on-one coaching, but the bulk of the responses are we use leaders to help our organization shift mindset. And some of the effectiveness, again, if you're not looking at this, I'll give you the highlights. The word cloud suggests some of you have got good outcomes from this. Some of you say limited in scope, inconsistent outcomes, pretty good, depends on the leader. That makes a lot of sense. So it looks to me, and I'm talking to the panel now, it looks to me like we've got a pretty wide variety of experiences with the topics, which is great. So I'll get the panel to introduce themselves now one by one, and then we'll keep us moving. So Barry, if you want to kick us off with a brief introduction.
Yeah, my name is Barry O'Reilly. I'm an entrepreneur, business advisor. I wrote Unlearn as well as another book, Lean Enterprise. It's part of Eric Ries's Lean Startup series. Yeah, been working with Lighthouse Group for the last couple of years and excited to share more about Unlearn.
I'll go next. Justin Size here, transformation partner with the Lighthouse Group. So I started my career in the sporting arena as an elite rower to an Australian level. So I'll use some examples from sport today. Have been involved in the corporate arena for a number of years and also an entrepreneur. Started my own business 13 years ago that is now a global leader in office fit out space. And I joined the Lighthouse Group around a year ago now to help deliver on my passion of helping other people and companies thrive. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation with the panel and the guests today. Over to you, Anthony.
Hi, everyone. My name's Anthony Wright. My background is predominantly accounting and law. I have worked in big corporates in both legal teams, finance, also systems and strategy roles. I then had my own business, which I sold to a private equity company in about 2019. That was in law, risk, governance and compliance. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I've been particularly involved in private equity, venture capital, startups, on a couple of boards as a non-executive director. And I'm particularly interested in just generally helping teams and businesses improve and succeed.
Fantastic. So from an audience perspective now, I really encourage you to, if there's something in those three backgrounds, you know, Barry as an author, thought leader on how to shift mindsets, done a lot of different things. Justin as an athlete, among his other identities. Anthony's experience. So type in the chat if there's something you want any one of those folks to really address for you in their comments as we progress through today's session. Now, as I mentioned, from a Lighthouse perspective, we really needed a credible, reliable, repeatable method to help individuals and groups shift their mindset to achieve the strategy of the organization that we're working with. And this is not something I'm sure you can all appreciate. It's not something you can do to someone. You know, that's a pretty poor approach if you try and change someone's mindset on their behalf. It's something you have to enable. It's something you have to invite people into. And I'm just really delighted to spend the next little period of time in our conversation to hear from Barry about the unlearn story. So Barry, over to you, and I'm happy to move the slides on your behalf.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm gonna wave like this every time we need to move the slide, just for fun. So where I'm going to start is not actually today, but over sort of 2,000 years ago, when the seed of a civilization, a startup, if you will, sprung into being in Seven Hills in Central Europe. And that startup went on to scale and sustain itself for many years as one of the greatest, if you will, cultures that we've known. Now, at the peak of its power, the Roman Empire accounted for roughly 20% of the world's population and covered nearly 2 million square miles. And there's lots of hypotheses about what allowed this culture, if you will, in particular, to scale and sustain itself for so long. So maybe in the chat, people can throw in, like, what do you think was the unique innovation to the Romans? What unique innovation to help the Romans sort of scale and sustain themselves? So you get some examples in the comments. Roads, thank you, right? Roads always comes up. Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah. Often people talk about, yeah, roads again. Great, love it. Okay. Yeah, their army comes up, you know, their systems of governance, infrastructure, aqueducts, right? These all things come up as awesome. Architecture, yeah. And the answer is like all of these things contribute. But there was one unique innovation to the Romans, and that is whenever they engaged cultures that had different or better practices than their own, they incorporated those practices into their systems of operation. So when they engaged with a new culture and they had better ways to mine wheat or to manage their sewage, they would start to incorporate those into their systems of operation. So in essence, they had a system that allowed them to both learn new skills and unlearn skills that were sort of limiting them. Right. And this sort of got me really interested about an idea. And I started, you know, we all hear a lot about learning organizations. It's very topical. Every company says they're a learning entity, but nobody really talks about unlearning stuff. So when I started to look around, I found this reference to Bo Henberg and in 1981, and he was one of the first people to start saying, look, as our knowledge grows simultaneously, it becomes obsolete as our reality changes. So really learning understanding is about understanding or taking in new information, but discarding obsolete or misleading information. And again, you feel this as a child, like the lessons you're told as a kid by your parents are simplifications, right? But as you grow, you sort of start to realize, oh, right, that is not really the reality. And this sort of got me really excited then about thinking about how that shows up in companies. And even if you think about like 20 years ago, you know, the largest companies, it was all about being number one in your market, grow through scaling people, have how many offices, how many countries are you in, how many physical stores do you have, you know, and even 10 years ago, it was still very much the case, right? And now, you know, in the last, you know, I even feel like putting 2020 up feels like a lifetime ago now, but it's like, this is, you know, the world changed because companies started using technology to scale their systems, right? I'll give you an example. Does anyone know how many people work on Apple Pay? How big do you think the team is for Apple Pay? It's 35 people. 35. Right, and that and how much they serve, you know, the global community with 35 people, right? So this is sort of like the way we have these changes. So, but leaders get trapped in a very linear mindset. They believe the things that made them successful in the past will be the things that make them successful in the future. But innovation sort of happens on this exponential type curve. Right, and you know, there's so many examples of this. Cloud computing, right? 5 years ago, if I told banks to use cloud, they would have laughed me out of the, saying that's crazy. We can't have our applications on AWS. Today, if you don't, you're losing money. ChatGPT, right? Like OpenAI were building large learning models for years, and then they made a chat interface, and now, you know, it's the fastest adopted product in history, right, with an exponential curve. So this is the way the world changes. But the truth is, most people think disruption happens to companies, but the truth is it happens to individuals. We get stuck in our mindset, our behaviors, the things that we're comfortable with, right? So that's the disruption that happens, is it's at an individual level. So just like a product has features, and you've got to constantly innovate the features of your product for it to stay relevant in its market, humans have behavior. So if you're not constantly innovating your behavior to match the market, that's where you're struggling, right? So for me, I've stopped writing emails. Most of the time, I just use AIs to give me like 25% that I need to work on, and 75% it's done by the bot, right? And these are like really fascinating ways to write blogs, newsletters, content, social content, all these things that are changing the way I do business. Right, so this is what really got me to unlearning then. And the way I describe an unlearning, a lot of people get pretty upset when I walk in and say, you need to unlearn. They're sort of like, hang on a sec, you're saying everything in my 25-year career doesn't matter anymore? And nothing could be further from the truth. No, the way I describe unlearning is, it's a process of letting go or moving away from once useful mindsets and acquired behaviors that were effective in the past, but now limiting our success. So it's not forgetting, removing, or discarding your knowledge or experience. It's the conscious act of letting go of outdated information and actively taking in new information to inform your decision-making and action. So it's a system, right? And this is a learnable system, therefore it's a scalable system. So, you know, hopefully you're all sitting there going, well, hang on a sec, Barry. The Romans unlearned. This Bo Henberg character seems to unlearn. Looks like companies are unlearning. How do I know what I need to unlearn? Right, and I'll give you a little teaser. Here's 4 questions I'm going to ask you, and you can write it down. All right, have you got a bit of paper? Yeah, it's good. Everyone grabbing their paper. Love it. All right, so can you think of a situation where you're not living up to the outcomes you're aiming for? Maybe you're not meeting the expectations you have for yourself. And maybe there's a situation that you're sort of struggling with. You've tried a bunch of things, but you're not getting a breakthrough. Or maybe somewhere that you're just totally avoiding altogether because you just can't even think how you would tackle it. Right? So not living up to the outcomes you're aiming for, not meeting your expectations you have for yourself, situations you're avoiding or struggling with, or maybe you've tried everything that you can think of and you're not getting a breakthrough. Now, when I ask people that question, and I'm sure I can see people like scribbling down, it's not one thing that comes to mind. It's like 5 or 6 things that start popping up, right? And these are all signals when you're hitting roadblocks or obstacles that your existing behavior is not working, and therefore you need to change it, right? And that was sort of the aha for me, is that this was actually a system. If I could help people diagnose where they may need to unlearn, and reframe the obstacles that they were facing as outcomes they actually wanted to achieve, then they could start to experiment by relearning new behaviors, experimenting and trying new actions to get to the outcome they're aiming for. And then that would lead to breakthroughs in performance, insight, and general function overall. And the great thing about this is that it wasn't sort of one and done. You know, it's like it's a system that the more you practice it, the better you get and the more virtuous it becomes. And like I said, I've taught this system now to executives from Capital One to Spotify, Slack, companies all over the world. And I even have a podcast where I've interviewed them all, so you can listen to these people's stories too as well if you're interested. Right. And again, when people sort of start to go down this path, they wonder, like, where do I start? And often, you know, people will say, oh, we need to unlearn. They write down very big things, like we need to unlearn the culture of this company, or we need to unlearn, you know, how we do our procurement process for businesses. And that's great to like think big, but you don't want to think big and start big. You got to sort of think big and start small. So if you want to change the culture of your company, you start by changing yourself. You start by thinking like, how can I exhibit new behaviors? And this is where I always say to people, it's important to think big, start small, and learn fast. Start with yourself. Start role modeling on learning that you're aiming for. And as you role model that, it inspires your team. And as you see other teams start to sort of inspire one another, that's where you get this massive organizational shift, right? And I've loads of examples of this happening. I'll share for like the second half of the segment. But to give you, like, this is a huge part really of the mantra of unlearning. It's thinking big, starting small, and learning fast. And like I said, I've been lucky enough, had the pleasure to work with some really world-class companies in doing this. Again, I'll share some more of the little anecdotes as we get into the panel discussion. But when I wrote this book, one of the lead stories that I started with was sharing the story of Serena Williams, who is probably like one of the greatest athletes probably we've known. You know, and in her 30s, she had an injury in her ankle in Munich. She was #1 in the world at the time, but then she had to sit out for a while. She competed at Wimbledon or the US Open and got to the final and lost. The next Grand Slam she competed to it was in Australia. She got to the 4th round and lost. But in Paris, she lost in the 1st round. And people were writing her off. She was done. The average age of tennis players to retire is 27. She was 31. But after that losing in that match, she went around Paris and she bumped into a tennis coach called Patrick Monfreboux, and he watched her practice. And basically what happened after that practice is he gave her some tough feedback that gave her some new insight about how she would play and behave. And she started practicing with him for the week. At the end of that week, she fired her dad as her coach, affectionately known as the former Will Smith, but no, actually her real father. And she hired Patrick as her coach. And she went on to actually start winning more. She got to more Grand Slam finals, won more titles in the age of 31 to 37 than she did in her subsequent years before. And then when I launched the book, I sent her and Patrick a copy of it, which he gave to her just before the Australian Open in 20 whatever the book came out, 2020. So that's a picture of her reading Unlearn too as well, which is always a fun anecdote about some of the people that have applied this, and a little bit of a bridge to some of the great work Justin, I'm sure, has done in athletics, and Anthony too as well in his work. So there you go.
Thanks, Barry. Hey, one thing we might tackle now, and I'll just plant the seed for all three of you. Sunny in the chat has just posted one of the most interesting dilemmas, right? So, and maybe I'll just get you to address this one first, Barry, but in the way you see it, what sort of conditions need to be created for people to overcome the fear of going from like a deep expert or a master into something that might be out of their comfort zone, something that they're very new at?
Yeah, like I often talk, there's a lot of characteristics that you need to cultivate if you're going to unlearn, right? There's sort of 5 of them. But the one that sort of I always think is actually one of the most important is creating safety to succeed. And that's the whole notion of thinking big, starting small, and learning fast, right? When you think big and go big, you become too big to fail, right? Like if you have a new idea for a business and you're like, oh, I've got to get $1 million and the first release has to be perfect, and it can't fail if it goes wrong. But if you have a new idea and you get $1 and you try something and see what works and what doesn't and learn your way through it. That's managing risk, right? And so that's what I always say with facing fear. It's important to have a big aspiration, but start small, and that means you're safe to fail. It means you invest, learn cheaply, and you get a fast feedback loop. So that's the one I would throw out there.
Thanks.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I did say it's a great question, that just having that willingness to fail, like as part of your mindset, and a culture of that within an organisation. I heard about Ryan Reynolds. He was interviewed in Success magazine, and they were asked, you're an actor, and he owns a football club in the UK, as many people probably know, but he also runs a creative agency. And they said, Ryan, how'd you get into creative? And he said, well, I was a little bit concerned to start with, but then I was like, everyone's been shit at something once. Like I've not always been a great actor, and I think that's a really good kind of mindset, that you've got to start somewhere, right? And having that ability to fail is really important, rather than thinking you're going to be an expert from the get-go.
Perfect. Well, we're gonna, we'll keep the dialogue moving, but we got a little structure. So we'll start with Anthony. So Anthony, from your various experiences, how has mindset, played a part?
I think the most important part, and when I reflect on the types of people I've typically worked with, are professionals that have gone to university and they're an accountant, they're in corporate finance, they might be a lawyer, an engineer, and all of those things that we get taught to do from the first day at school to the first day at university, we get told to follow what's been done before. Here's a template, here's a precedent, here's a process that we need to follow. And by the way, don't stuff it up. So it's really, to me, the first part of changing mindset. And if I'm in a team and I'm listening to the leader or the business owner talk about changing mindset, the first thing that I think to myself is why? Why should I care? Like, why should I listen to you? Why should I care? What are you going to do for me? Now, I might not say those things in that team environment, but that's what I'm thinking. And so I try and break down that mindset and why change and how to unlock mindset into 3 or 4 very simple questions. Why? So why should I care? Why should I do this? And often, as Barry mentioned, that's connecting back to, is it going to make my life a bit better? Is it going to make my job a bit easier? Is it actually going to have the converse effect, and it's going to make my job harder and add more stress to my life? When am I going to do it? And how am I going to do it? But really starting with that concept of why and what's in it for me as the individual. I really liked your example at the start, Eric, about taking technical people and convincing them that selling is okay. I've spent 20 years of my career, my working life, trying to convince technical people that selling is about problem solving, and particularly lawyers and accountants detest the word sales. But in my view, everyone is in business development. So why is business development important to everyone in an organization? And then how to do it. And then being imperfect is completely okay. I'll just pause there, Eric.
No, that's great. So if anybody has a question for Anthony or wants him to elaborate on any of that, now's the time. Just pop yourself off of mute. I'm really, in your experiences, particularly with some merger acquisitions and things, where organizational cultures either come together or fail to come together. That's a point of curiosity for me, Anthony, in your background. Like, how have you seen it work the best, or are there things that are overlooked?
I think it, without a doubt, the most important part is the leadership. And it's having the right people displaying the right behaviours and the right actions to encourage two groups of people and two cultures with different values and different beliefs and different acceptable behaviours to somehow work together, which comes back to leadership.
Right. Anyone with a question or something they want Anthony to elaborate on? If not, you'll have many other opportunities, but I'll hold some space for you now.
Eric, maybe I might shoot one. How do we handle a situation where change is greater than learning? So we're all going through these changes, especially in the technology space. Yes, I do understand that we all need to focus on the ball, but in this kind of environment where change is way too much, which kind of reveals the weaknesses in the leadership, organizational structures, and getting employees to buy in, and getting them to be more flexible. How do you do that? It's not an easy thing. So that's going to be my question.
Right. So if I heard the question right, it's big with the massive amount of change, the pace of change. How do we get people to buy into the changes they need to make to keep up? Is that
Yes.
close? Okay.
Yeah, close, yeah.
Well, I'll give the panel a crack first, then I've got a view. Barry, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I was going to encourage you to go ahead, Eric. Share,
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, I'm especially I'm reflecting on 58% of you or us in this virtual session said that we rely on our line leaders or our supervisors to help with the change, right? To help with the mindset shifting. There's a few of you who used coaching, but in my experience, all change needs to happen in the context of a conversation. And in my experience, it's that first level leader and equipping her or him to be effective and confident in leading a conversation that has no certainty in it, because you don't know what's happening for that other person. But to give that individual in a people manager capacity the skills and the confidence to enter into a conversation to help understand what the employee is going through, that ultimately then can unlock what's required to move them ahead. And I think that's the difference with the pace of change today. When I first started, it was about change management, and we'd go through the pro-sci model, and it was helpful, still is helpful, but you can't have a full change management effort for all the changes that are happening at the moment. So it's those people leaders and their ability to help their direct reports take a different perspective that, in my experience, is the way to do it at scale and at pace.
Thank you, Eric. Yeah.
They're queuing up. This is good. Got a couple more questions popping in. Let's just go to Justin. Justin, you were going to attack this from a particular perspective. So why don't you let us know from your experience, how does mindset play a part in performance?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. As I said, I'd like to use a couple of case studies from sport and from my rowing background. And I know I've got a hard marker here of Ben Dobwell's on the call, who's a more illustrious has a more illustrious rowing career than I do. So I'm sure he'll be giving me some feedback afterwards. But prior to the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, the British 8 had a pretty lackluster performance. I think they'd been struggling to make the final, but there was a real mind shift for them prior to the 2000 Olympics in Sydney that Ben was actually part of as well. And they decided that there was one key question that they were going to ask themselves about everything that they did, and it was like, will it make the boat go faster? That became what one of the 8 referred to as their bullshit filter. And so, for the next period of time, every bit of information that they engage with and anyone that they engage with, they would ask themselves that question and use one of the analogies out of Barry's book, they emptied their cup. They had to empty their cup first around what were their preconceived ideas, perceptions around training, how they'd approach competition, what the naysayers had said about the fact that they were never going to be able to perform at an international level, and then they had to start refilling it based on that filter. And the result was that they achieved a gold medal at the Sydney Olympics, and unfortunately that relegated the Aussies to a silver in the process. But look, it's an amazing example of how they unlearned, they relearned based on this new filter that they'd all built into, and they had a breakthrough as a consequence, and it led to an astounding result for them. And yeah, I was part of the Queensland Kings Cup crew in 2001, and that was something that we used as our motivation. Again, we're asking ourselves the question, what will make the boat go faster? We hadn't won a Queensland Kings Cup for over 60 years, 1939, and Victoria, a crew, and again, I'll pick on Benny, but I think he was part of the New South Wales crew. But Victorians had won for several years, and they had the multi-Olympians and world champions, the Awesome Foursome, that I'm sure everyone's aware of. And we had to unlearn the fact that we thought that we were always going to be, we didn't have the opportunity to win because we had these guys that were Olympians in the crew. And the approach that we'd taken to training was that our small boats, so singles, pairs, etc., were the priority, and we just got together a couple of weeks before the race to get together in the 8. So, I mean, for us, it was about unlearning that, like how have we done it before, and that we weren't, it was going to be very hard for us to win, and to really start filling our cup again around what was going to lead to us being able to win this thing, how we're going to make the boat go faster. And that was spending more time together as a team. So we spent months together, and we were constantly asking ourselves that question. And we were I remember sitting on the start line, and there was just this euphoria and this kind of feeling as a crew, this camaraderie and this feeling that we were going to win this thing. And coming into the last 500 metres, and please make sure Benny's on mute here. But we were really bearing down on the New South Wales and Victorian crews that were in first and second place. And unfortunately, I don't know if anyone's heard of the analogy catching a crab, but one of our crew members basically they lost control of their oar. It went under the boat, and it basically stops the boat, slams the brakes on. So we didn't have the fairy tale ending there like the Brits did, but we came as close as we had ever come since 1939 to achieving that. So, I mean, that for me is look. There was a question in the comments from someone about what is common between business and sport to be able to get that mindset shift, and it's about having an aligned goal and direction that everyone buys into, and that is really important. And once you have that, then and you're all pulling in the same direction, then that's when great things happen. So whether it's in the sporting arena, whether it's in the business arena, I think having that aligned goal and having the willingness to kind of move past and unlearn and refill your cup with the things that are actually going to help you achieve that goal is what it's all about.
So good. So Barry, you've worked with some amazing brands. We saw a few of those on the screen before, and I'm just curious, how has this process helped those brands or some of the individuals within those companies achieve their goals?
Yeah, one example that springs to mind, I think it ties in a little bit to Susie's question about how do you help leaders when they need to change and it's going to be hard. I actually think one of the most important things is recognizing and saying to people this is going to be hard. One example that springs to mind with that is working with American Airlines, and they had a history of doing big change projects that were always late, always under-delivered, always over budget. they'd been through so many transformation and change programs that there was change fatigue, you know, constant shifting in priorities that goes with that, and people were sort of exhausted, you know. But one of the things that was so good about that, Maya is their CIO, but Stephen Lice was their head of technology. He runs all of their customer-facing technology products, so from the mobile app to the website to check-in and so forth. You know, and one of the things they knew that they couldn't keep doing was just keeping throwing more money at the problem or more people at the problem to trying to get a different result. So they fundamentally revisited about how they built companies, right? They would start, or projects even, that they would start much smaller, that they would just have small teams to try and set a goal over the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and see if they could start to achieve it. They had to reset all their relationships with their business partners. They had to find a business partner that was willing to sort of deliver less to achieve more in the long term by working with them in a new way to start delivering. And a lot of this was all about doing small things frequently to start building momentum and confidence and evidence that change is starting to happen and it's working. And it's amazing how that flywheel then starts to have an effect, right? When you faster feedback loops, when people can see a little bit of change happening every day rather than waiting for a big change every 6 months, that's what builds your momentum, and you start to break hard things down into small little steps. And very much like Justin's examples here, right? Like every day, the team feeling like, are we getting better? Are we getting faster? Is there one little tweak that we tried? Did we take 1/10 of a second off the time? You know, like these are huge things that build momentum and compound over time. So yeah, that would be one example that jumps to mind. And there's a case study here I'll share in the chat too as well. And you know, I've done a great podcast as well with Stephen that I highly recommend people listen to. And you know, a lot of it is about that idea of having fortitude and telling people you're going on a journey together that has an unknown destination and will be hard. So let's figure it out together. You know, and that's I think very, very important.
Eric, can I just add to
Yeah.
Barry's comments there, and just addressing your question, Susie? I think it's so important to be transparent and frank about the situation. And let's say the change or the improvement area is around costs or cost reduction. And acknowledging upfront that these things are difficult and they'll have people impacts on a daily basis or potentially longer term. I think a lot of people have, and I'm not sure if this is increasing as we're flooded with more and more information, but people have got a really high radar for bullshit. And they see right through a lack of transparency. And I think a key is to be very careful on how you frame things, and then how you frame things in being truthful and transparent, but also then implicitly talking about what's in it for me or how will it impact the individuals that you're talking to.
Yeah, great. One of the things that just occurred to me is, as Barry was talking, as Justin was talking, sometimes one of the advantages we have in sport is the feedback loop is so measurable. Like if you leave the soccer pitch and you just lost 4-0, well, you know, you just lost 4-0. And Barry's point about, did we shave 1/10 of a second off of our lap time, right? So something about the measurability of what we do in our work settings is super important. And to use fast feedback cycles means that we've got to have small things that we can measure. And one of the things, which is one of the things that I appreciate about the Unlearn system. I want to keep us on time, and man, I wish we had 2 hours instead of 1. But I just want to invite each of the panelists, given what you've heard of the audience and where they're at, given what's been in the chat, given the conversation, is there kind of one thing you would encourage folks to take away from our session today? So what's your one thing? And anybody can start.
I think we're all being polite. So I'll go Justin to save the silence, and then maybe throw it to Justin, and after that, one thing I would encourage you all to think about is whatever you wrote down when I threw those questions of what you need to unlearn. Maybe think about sit down and have a look at it, and whatever you came up with, maybe it's like perfectionism, maybe it's like decision making, maybe it's whatever. Like, go and find someone you trust and say to them, look, this is something I want to get better at. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how good do you think I am at decision making? And hopefully they'll be kind and they know you, and they'll say, you're a 4, Barry. And I'll go, awesome, 4 out of 10. How could I get to 4.5? Is there something I could do, you think, in the next week that I could get to 4.5? And when they give you some advice, pick the most uncomfortable thing and try that, just to really shake yourselves up. And I guarantee if you do that for a week and you come back next week, you'll probably be at a 5 or 6, maybe even a 7. And then just if you get in that habit of just trying to get half a point better every week, I think you'll be amazed at the progress.
Great. So something small, and even in what you just said, Barry, you've implied or you suggested a measure. Sometimes the best measure is someone else's 1 to 10 rating. And so I think there's a lot in what you just said that I want to kind of unpack, which is having someone else play with you. Measure about how good is it now and where does it want to be. And then, of course, in Barry's example, he didn't say, well, I'd like to get from a 4 to a 9 next week, right? So getting into these tiny little increments of improvement. So there we go. Good wisdom from our author today. Thanks, Barry.
Pleasure.
Yeah, look, for me, Eric, it's about mindset. It's not about thinking positively or negatively. And again, you referencing Barry's book, it's about how you process information. So letting go of that outdated information and actively engaging and taking on new information. And back to that reference that I said, what is it that's actually going to help you achieve your goal, and really being very kind of focused on the fact that you're not going to let information that's not in line with that to get in and clutter your mind or fill your cup. I think that is the key thing. That's not about I'm thinking positively, or I'm thinking my growth mindset is about me thinking positively. It's about the information, or to Anthony's point, we're just getting, it's a fire hydrant of information that's coming at us. News, email, calls, everything, our colleagues, etc., family life. So we need to be very selective about what we're taking in, and I think that is the key and the takeaway for mine.
Great, thanks, Justin. So it's like that, sometimes we teach leadership like leading self, leading others, leading the business, right? These 3 parts of what a great leader has. So you just really dove deep into leading self. Like if I'm going to lead myself well and I have a goal, I'm going to isolate myself from the things that are going to distract me or tell me I can't do it.
100%.
Fabulous. Anthony.
I'm reflecting on some of Justin's stories about coming third. It made me think about sport, and Eric, you referenced this about 9 times out of 10, a sporting team, whether it's social or professional, you're there to win, and the win-loss is black and white. Everyone can see it. It's really hard in business to define winning. But what I really tried myself when I had my own business, and then tried to impart this on the people I worked with in the team, is that we're there to win. And then it's about trying to define, what does winning look like? Who's our competition? Why we hate our competition, and how we're going to beat them. But to Barry's point, little steps get you down the road. And talk about changing mindset. For a long, long time in my own business, my password was "we will win," with numbers after it. But that was my mindset. And then it's how you impart that on the people that you work with.
Hmm. And maybe I'll tie that, Anthony, or I'll ask you to tie it to something Lisa was kind enough to put in the chat. You know, her generous comment was that we need to assume that our people want to do better, and that if we can help them connect somehow to their own, you know, I'll toss in the word intrinsic motivation, right, to use a big word. What's your connection point there in terms of when you were running that business?
That's a really interesting point, and it means different things to different people. So there might be an organizational or a team interpretation of what winning would look like. But winning for an individual might be going home at the end of the day being a bit happier. Not everyone loves work, but how do you go home from work at the end of each week being content? That might be that particular individual's interpretation of winning, and that's fantastic.
Nice.
I was listening to a podcast, I should say, this morning, and it was mentioned that performance equals motivation times capability. And I think everyone has motivation, but do they have, to Anthony's point, where is their motivation? So again, and we talk about this, it's the alignment of people's purpose, passions at an individual level with what you're trying to achieve as an organisation. And so I think back to your point, Eric, around the frontline leaders and how they're engaging with their teams and really understanding what motivates people and how does that align to what we're trying to achieve as a team and what our strategy is the real essence of making sure that we get people, you know, on the bus, or to use the rowing analogy, pulling in that same direction. So everyone has motivation, but how do we get it aligned to what we're trying to achieve and get the outcomes that we want to achieve is key.
Perfect. You know, we get so many first-time managers, and you know, the first time you ever have a team, right? I know we can all think back to that. And what they don't tell you, but now why we're in business in many ways is that it's at least half the job is being a psychologist in its own form, right? Connecting individually to each person is it's a little underrated in terms of what we talk about as our careers progress. So, hey, I'm going to keep us on time. That was my promise, so I will follow through on that. So some of you probably are thinking about, well, what could this look like in practice, right? So I'll give you just a quick case study of how we at Lighthouse have used this process to move an organization towards its strategy. And so the example I'll give is it's a strata management company. They've got a role in their business called a community manager. And it's safe to say they will not achieve their strategy as an organization unless this role is really firing, unless it's really doing well, right? So it's a role that's both service and sales. These are really busy individuals who require a lot of different knowledge and capability. Unfortunately, their customers are typically time poor and they only come and talk to them about problems and issues. And then as a result of that, right, a bit of turnover and lack of experience in their cohort, right? So that organization knew they needed to shift, help that group shift itself. And so as we worked with them, before we, you know, got into the actual shifting, we did a process where we understood the 3 core challenges that needed to shift. So in the unlearn process, you've got to get specific about the challenge you're going to unlearn, right? Barry mentioned unlearn delegation. How do I unlearn stress? How do I unlearn other things? So this organization, these community managers needed to unlearn their perception that there's never enough time, never enough time. They needed to unlearn some really specific client situations, and they needed to unlearn the opportunity spotting, that was somehow not part of their job. They had to unlearn that so that they could begin to take some more opportunities to their sales team. And so the process, to put some shoes on this, right? It's a series of conversations, all hosted and facilitated. And in the end, in this example, and again, it's not typically 100% of the cohort goes from 100% mindset shift overnight, but individually, they all made shifts and they all began to do those tiny, uncomfortable things that Barry was referring to. And so we would, of course, love to work with anybody here or anybody who is maybe one of your friends or colleagues. You just know that this is relevant for them. So we've got a very structured package that we'd love to talk to you about. It's just beautifully suited for functional teams, finance, IT, HR, as well as cross-functional teams, or some of you now call them squads, who might need to take a new approach to a product launch or some development. So very, very versatile process, can be used in lots of contexts. And we'd just love to stay in touch with you. So please continue to join us on our monthly events. Invite your friends and hook us up on all the socials, because we're definitely active on LinkedIn. So it's bang on 1 o'clock. Thanks so much for your participation. And thanks again to our panel for their time and contribution. We will see you next month as we continue the Leading Transformation series. Have a great afternoon, everyone.